Today, we are looking at the lesson 2 for development policy and planning. That is the BED4129. My name is John Kenyua from the School of Social Sciences and the Department of Social and Development Studies. In today's lesson, we'll be looking at the introduction. We'll be introducing ourselves into what the whole unit is all about, at least the basics, to be able to understand at least the basics of development planning and policy. And in this case, then the objective for today's lecture is to talk about, to define the key terms that are used within this unit, say the terms to do with what development is, what do we mean by development, what do we mean by development planning, what do we mean by policy, and what do we mean by development policy. We'll be talking about these concepts, all these different concepts. Then we'll also be looking to bring out the relationship that we have between development policy and development planning. And then we'll go on to discuss issues to do with decision making and decision making points and models and tools within the context of development planning and policy. So, like we said, is that the whole aim of the policy that you develop here, or the plans that you come up within the context of this unit, is that they're supposed to advance or promote development. Then the big question is, then what is development? Now, development normally is about change, and this change is change within the context of the social, the political, or economic structures, and this can be within countries, or even within, or even between countries. Say, for example, when we talk about the EAC region, the East African bloc, economic bloc, or when we talk about the European Union, that is between countries, or even international relations, or even international cooperation between countries and nations when it comes to trade. But then, in this case, is that you'd find that development in most cases has more to do with bringing about positive change on people's lives, either at the individual level. It could be things to do with within groups or societies or communities, or it can also be within the nation at large, state, and even, like we said, regions, and even at the global context. But the key thing is that this development should trickle down to the person, what we refer to as mostly the bottom of the pyramid, the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, development in itself, or the definition of this, or definition for development, is not something that we don't have one definition that is overriding, or that would be said that define development in its fullness. But we have different definitions that have been offered when it comes to development, and the other way that you can also look at it, the other way that can also be defined development is that development can also be defined as a process involving community participation in critically identifying and analyzing their needs and problems, setting goals, making their own decisions on sustainable use of available resources to improve the quality of their own lives. How do you bring, or how do communities come together, or how do they get to be involved in taking advantage or leveraging on the resources that exist within their own environment, and guided or assisted in ways that they can be able to exploit them, but exploit them in a sustainable way. And exploit them also to improve their own quality of life. Because you might find, if you go within a society or community, and you find that probably they have a natural resource, like the case of what we have in Kenya, like in Turkana, where they have in oil, or when they are having underground aquifers. It's a question of then how do they exploit those natural resources, but also sustainably so, and use that exploitation or exploit those resources in a way that they'll be able to use what they have been able maybe to get from those resources to improve their own qualities of life. Maybe be able to build more schools, be able to build more roads, more hospitals for the whole community, maybe be able to create more employment, but also being able to limit their own individual or personal interests when exploiting these resources, so that then even the future generations would also have the opportunity to take advantage or to use those resources also for their own good. In essence, then, development in that context then can be viewed as a struggle, human struggle against things to do with oppression and trying to make life oppression and everything else that tries to make life more or less inhumane. In that regard, if you're trying to make life more humane, or is a struggle against oppression that makes life less humane, then you might also want to look at development then in that context in terms of human rights or entitlements. And in this way, development becomes a sustained elevation of the entire society and the social system towards better and more humane life. And what then do we mean by humane life or life being more humane? In this case, you'll be looking at three things. You'll be looking at life sustenance. You'll also be talking about freedom and self-esteem. And these are important components or aspects when it comes to improving or giving life more meaning to whoever development is targeted. When it comes to life sustenance, is that you'll be talking about the ability to access or to be provided for with the very basics that are required for survival or for a living, for a living. And in this case, you'll be looking at things to do with food, things to do with shelter, things to do with healthcare and protection. Those are normally seen as the very basics that any human being should have access to, or at least should be provided for, or should have, should be able to have should be able to have in their own lives. Then the other thing that we said about is self-esteem. Now, a good life also presupposes a sense of self-worth and self-respect. That is, of not being used as a tool by others for their own ends. All people and societies seek some form of self-esteem. Everybody have got their own self-dignity or self-respect. That it doesn't matter. It does not matter how much one might be, how many challenges a society or an individual or even a country might be facing. When you seek to bring development or to bring improvement or to advance or to promote growth within those sectors, you rather do so respecting or dignitively. You should do it dignitively so. And this is to mean that regardless of how one might look disempowered or seem not to have as much, when you providing or making, like what you talked about, life sustenance, things to do with the basics, when you're providing some of these basics, you'd have to do it with paying key attention to things to do with dignity and self-respect of these specific individuals. Like, take for example, if when in the moments when we normally have famine in some of our counties in Kenya, and you have people who are dying of hunger, they just don't have food. But then you go there and you want to provide them or to give them food, which is a basic need that they need, because if you don't have food, then it's a very high chance that you may not be able to live long. But then you provide food, but this food that you're providing is, say for example, like what you have had stories of in the past, is dog food, is food that is normally given to the food on a normal basis, on a conventional, in a normal circumstance, it's normally given to dog. Now, if you go and give that food to even someone who is dying, and then you tell them, or they come to learn that food is normally given to dogs, there is a very high chance that some of them, even if, regardless of how hungry they might be, they're not going to eat it because of what we call self-dignity or self-respect. They would rather choose to die than eat something that is given to animals. And these are a question of things to do with self-esteem and its relation to development and human life. Then the other component that we talked about when it comes to making life more humane is about freedoms, expanding freedoms. When it comes to development, you might also want to look at it as expanding freedoms. And freedom, here we'll be looking at freedom from servitude, means emancipation from alienating materials and conditions of life, which create servitude of nature, social systems, other men, institutions, and dogmatic beliefs. Say, for example, for those that have found themselves within an environment where there are those beliefs or practices that they themselves may not necessarily be adhering or believing in them per se, but because of the circumstances within which they are being brought up, that some of these dogmatic beliefs are exercised, then they find themselves that they don't have a choice. It's not a question of whether they want to or whether they don't want to. It's that they don't have a choice. They have to. Take for example, we have also in Kenya some of the practices. Say for example, what we have the FGM or the female genital mutilation. So you have girls that are born within a society where that is a practice. So regardless of whether she likes it or she does not like it, she does not have the freedom of choice to choose whether or not to participate in it or whether to participate in it or not to participate in it. And therefore, then in that case, or in that specific context, development then coming to deal with, say, outlawing or trying to end FGM, in that context, is that you're trying to expand the freedom of the individuals or the girl child that have been born within that society. Because now, if it becomes outlawed, if it becomes that it is not a must that someone should go through FGM, then whoever chooses then to go through it is that they do it by choice. They choose to, because it makes their life more happier or more fulfilling. And someone who chooses not to, also, it's not forced to do it. They have the freedom to choose that which advances or brings more happiness in their own lives. And so development can also be viewed in terms of expanding human freedoms. Now, the other term that we also cropping up quite often within this unit is about policy. Now, the question is, what do you mean by policy? Now, policy is typically described as a principle or rule to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. It can also be considered as a statement of intent or commitment. And for that reason, at least decision makers can be held accountable for the policy that they come up with. Sometimes you'd find that policies, because they are overriding, like we said, it's more of a guide. It provides the framework within which certain objectives can be able to be achieved. It guides. So if you're talking about maybe making access to education, coming up with a policy about access to education, quality education, maybe for the primary, for the secondary, or for the tertiary institutions, is that you provide a policy, you provide a guide that everybody who wants to implement that specific policy can borrow from or can ride on. But in most cases, you also find that sometimes policy itself is confused with what we refer to as procedures or protocols. Now, a protocol defines the set of procedures or steps that are supposed to be followed for the accomplishment of a given task. And in this case, the protocols are more discriminatory. They provide criteria of who is supposed to do what and when And how are they supposed to do it? What else for procedures? For procedures, it only gives you steps of how to implement some specific sections, maybe within a policy. But for protocols, it goes further. Within those steps, saying who then is supposed to be involved in carrying out those specific steps or those specific, or the roles or the responsibilities or the activities that are involved within the steps that have been outlined within a procedure. But all this, it is possible for you to find procedures and protocols that are embedded within a policy, or maybe to put it in a better way, is that policies, once you get policies, you can be able to develop procedures out of a policy, or even develop protocols from procedures of a policy. That's an important difference that I thought it would be good for me to bring out. Now, policies, and especially when it comes to public policies, or even within institutions or organizations, is that they are normally adopted by the senior mosts at the highest level, or the highest governing body of an institutions. That's where you find that most of the policies apply or adopted or are implemented or ratified. in the context of a country or a government, that you find that the policies are adopted maybe at the executive level. What else now for procedures and for protocols? These are the ones that are normally developed or adopted by senior executives within an institution or an organization, or even within a country. But essentially, it says that the procedures and the protocols borrow from what or ride on the policy itself, and may not be like the whole policy. It might be a specific element within that specific policy. The policy, therefore, does apply. You might find policies within a government. You can have a policy that have been developed by a government. You can have policies that have been developed maybe by within an organization, private sector, or for profit. We do also have policies that come as presidential executive orders. We do have policies within groups and individuals. We do have policies that exist within corporate institutions, or even the parliamentary rules order, and you find policies all over. We also have policies within all the different social media platforms that we have, and you have policies. That does not necessarily mean that all policies are implemented by a government or within a national context. You have policies even at these other different sectors or areas. Now, policies are a little bit different from rules. It's a little bit different from a rule or from a law, because what else for a law is that if you break a law, then you are liable, or you'll be perceived to be guilty, and you can be taken to a court of law, and even jailed or even fined. But for policy, it's more of, it provides only a guide, and it only guides actions, reading or guiding towards achieving a specific desired outcome or goal. And so if you don't follow the guides, then it means that you're not going to, the only punishment that you receive if you don't follow a policy is that the goals that have been envisioned within that policy will not be realized. If the goal of a policy is to improve access to education, quality education within a specific area, and you refuse to follow the policy, is that eventually when you come to look or evaluate access to quality education in that specific area, is that you find has not been realized. Maybe people are still not able to achieve or to access quality education. And the consequence, and the reason is because the policy that was developed for that purpose was not implemented. Now, when it comes to policy in this context, we might want to look at public policy, or the policies that are developed by the government. And for public policy, in this case is that because remember we said that we have policies at different institutions, we have policies at the national level, we have policies for organizations, for even groups, individuals, and like we said, even for social media. But then when it comes to public policy, these are more policies, these policies are normally taken or developed and addressed by governments. In this case, public policy is the action taken by a government to address a particular public issue. Local, state, federal, and international government organizations all craft and implement public policy to protect and benefit their populations. Now, when it comes to public policy, it is normally purposeful. It's only purposeful course of action or inaction followed by some actors, notably public authorities, such as government bodies and officials, in dealing with a problem or cluster of problems of public or general interest. Public policy also, in that case, then involves or the making of a public policy, rather. The making of public policy is normally the responsibility of public authorities or elected or appointed officials, individuals who are working within the larger government bureaucracy, be it either working in the ministries, or working in the parliament, working in the executive. Those are the individuals that normally would be involved in coming up or have the responsibility of coming up with what we refer to as public policy. That is not to say that we don't have public policy that emanate from anywhere outside the government. We do, but the most important thing is that the government or some of the government representative must be involved in coming up with that policy for it to be referred to as being a public policy. It has to be adopted within the larger national policy framework for it to be referred to as a public policy. Then we look at what then do we mean by development policy, because remember, like we said, is that public, in most cases, and especially in the context of a nation or a country, is that or a state, is that development policy will always be, in that case, will always be a public policy. But not all public policies are development policies. And here then is the question of what then do we mean by development policy? What then here do we mean by development policy? In this case, development policy refers to activities that aim to reduce poverty and implement fundamental rights and promote sustainable development globally or even nationally, at the national level. And so the key thing to say there is the element of reducing poverty or implementing fundamental rights and areas to do with promoting development. And remember what we discussed development as being. You can also define development policy as a means of supporting peace building, reforming the security sector. That is to promote things to do with security. As we said, is one of basic needs under life sustenance. Things to do with collecting taxes, because if you're going to provide services, then you can only provide services based on what you have in terms of resources to promote collection of those taxes. Then things to do with designing social protection, managing public services, and promoting human rights and freedoms. Then what do we mean? The other term that you also want to look at is planning. And in this case, planning is a fundamental management function which involves deciding beforehand what is to be done, when is it to be done, and how is it to be done, and who is going to do it. It's planning beforehand, preparing beforehand what's supposed to be done, and the individuals who are going to be involved, and their roles and their responsibility. It can also be viewed as an intellectual process which lays down an organization's objectives and develops various courses of action by which the organization can achieve those objectives, and it checks out exactly how to attain a specific goal. And in most cases, you'd find that planning itself is a choice, is that you choose given different goals or objectives that you have and different alternatives that can be able to be used to achieve either of those goals or objectives, then you choose which objective or which goal do you want to pursue, and then how do you aim to achieve those goals and objectives. Then what then do we mean by development planning? Because we have looked at what we mean by development, and we have also looked at what we mean by planning. Then what do you mean by development planning? This is broadly defined as planning of an organized endeavor that aims at promoting development. It encompasses a wide range of thrust in economic, social, and institutional fields at various societal levels, from the local to the international, and usually emphasizes relations between society spheres and units. Here, development planning addresses values, objectives, resources, organizational abilities, and range of variables or different factors in the environment of development organizations and its pursuits. And this one could be development organization, or even could be a nation or a country in this case. You might also want to look at development planning as a strategic and measurable goal that a person, an organization, a community, or even a nation plans to meet within a certain amount of time. Usually, development plan includes things to do with time-based benchmarks. Because if you're coming up, like we said, if you're coming up with a development plan and aims to achieve specific objectives, say for example, you want to improve access to quality education, you want to improve access to quality healthcare, you want to improve maybe the infrastructure that exists within a specific region, is that you aim to achieve them within a given specific time period. Because you cannot say that you aim to achieve them, but it's not time bound because of, remember, of what we talked about, it being smart. It has to be within specific period of time that you aim to achieve the development plans that you have come up with. Now, when it comes to development planning, we do have a number of challenges that you normally be faced with, and one of the challenges when it comes to development planning is difficult in predicting the future because of the uncertainty that surrounds it. Because, like we're saying, that the planning is you are planning based on what is perceived to be how the future is going to look like. But the future is not always static, and you don't have all the information about how the future is going to look like. We have there are many variables that are going to be involved, or many factors that are going to come into play into that future, and so which might render the plan that you have come up with to be obsolete and of no consequence, or even of becomes impossible even to achieve, or not even important in that context. And so it is the future is, predicting the future or forecasting the future is very complex, and people cannot be expected to understand all the events and other interactions fully, essentially. Then there are things that is that the future is not static, because when you're planning about the future and your forecasts and the forecast that you have been able to come up with at the moment, is that the future is going to, like we said, we have many variables or factors that are going to come into play. It is not as static as might be perceived by the plans that you come up with now. And that, of course, makes the plans that you come up with in the future becomes a little bit more challenging when it comes to pursuing. Because what happens when the context changes, or the objective? The objective, of course, would also change as a consequence. The other challenge that you have in development planning is that development is described by very practical concerns, but itself is bedeviled by contested theories. And we have things to do with the classical theory of development. We have the Marxist theories of development. We have different and many theories that try to describe how you can be able to promote development in specific regions or specific areas effectively. But then is a question of, and you find all these theories, they have the same objective, but they prescribe different ways of achieving those specific objectives. And so it becomes a little bit challenging for you to choose then which theory do you choose to employ, and under which circumstances, and in which and for which areas or specific regions, and at what scope, and at what region, and with what kind of focus. That itself then becomes another challenge. Then the other challenge that we also have when it comes to development planning is that there are inevitable hidden or unintended consequences of the development plan that you have come up with, things that that had not been anticipated from the very beginning. And some of them can be negative, others can be positive, but you'll be more concerned about the negative consequences of the development plan that you have come up with, or that has been implemented. Then the other thing that we might also want to look at is that about development planning and implementation, because you'd find that since the moment when development became an important area to pursue within the developing countries, and an area that have been supported and campaigned for and lobbied for by the international development partners, is that we find countries and nations have always been able to come up with plans, very good development plans in the developing countries. Like in Kenya, they normally say that we have very good development plans that we had since 1970s, or when the country was getting independence. And some of these development plans were even borrowed by some countries like Singapore, which currently at the moment they are way ahead of us in terms of the GDP. The GDP per capita compared to where we are as a nation. And so it's a question, it has not normally always been a question of whether we're able to plan properly, but it's a question of whether we are able to implement those very good plans that we come up with for development. And it then becomes a paradox that we have had. The development concerns have always been a concern within developing countries, but then over time, countries, regardless of how good plans they have, we still have problems and poverty still ravaging these developing countries. So the question is, why do we still have poverty? And we have had plans to deal and to eradicate poverty since the countries received independence, or since the countries started pursuing development objectives and development goals. Like in the case of Kenya, when we received independence, one of the key goals of the government that we had, that was instituted at that time, in 1963, 1964, was one of the things that we wanted to deal with was things to do with disease, things to do with ignorance, and things to do with poverty. But still today, despite the fact that they also came up with plans that were supposed to address those key areas of concern, that still today we still are faced with those challenges, the challenges of access to quality healthcare, that's the challenges of disease, ignorance, still education, though we have made a lot of strides, but we still have a challenge there, and also with the areas of poverty. Then the other thing about development policy, development planning and implementation is a question of the MAIDs. One of the MAIDs about development planning is that formulating a plan and implementing are two separate processes. And you have this school of thought that assumes that whereas planning is easy, is direct, it's clear-cut, it's logical, it's rational, it's easy for you to think through and come up with a plan that can be implemented. It assumes, on the other hand, that implementation itself is not clear-cut, it's not easy, it's not something that can be easily implemented. And this then becomes a challenge, because for you to be able to come up with a development plan that is effective and that can be able to achieve its objective, the objective that have been laid out within that specific within that development plan, is that when you're coming up with a plan, you should also come up with the implementation, because the two cannot be divorced. Development plan and development implementation should always be perceived to be one and the same thing, so that then the question of one having a plan and not being implemented is becomes an issue that can be able to address in that regard. And that is the end of our session. Thank you so much.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.